Hello everyone, how's it going? Vasco here. In this lesson we're going to implement the user selection dropdown. Let's start by pasting in some HTML. So this is just plain HTML. It's a label that says select the user and a list of options for the different names. So currently we are hard coding our user as being of ID 1 of Alice, but our application will have a few more users to choose from in order to really simulate the chat environment. Now let's think for a moment how we will implement this logic. What we really want to do is detect the select change event of this dropdown. So there is a change event that is built in Angular. When this change event is triggered, we want to trigger a method that is part of the user selection smart component. So this is a smart component. We will call this method onSelectUser and we will pass it the ID of the user that was selected. So in the case of Alice, 1, in the case of Bob, 2, etc. Inside onSelectUser, we simply want to trigger a new action, selectUser, and we are going to pass in the ID of the user that we just selected. We are going to dispatch that to the store, and the store will simply handle this in the following way. There won't be a reducer associated to this action because we really want to create a side effect, which is load the data for the user that corresponds to that ID. So this means that what we're going to do is we're going to add more logic here in the load threads effect service. We're going to detect the new user changed action, and in response to that we are going to load the user threads from the backend. So let's start implementing this. So here we call onSelectUser. Let's create this method. Let's start by implementing onSelectUser on the user selection component. So this will be a very simple method. We are simply going to pass in here the user ID, which will be a number. Actually, let's call it new user ID so that we make it clear that it's the result of switching user. And as usual in any smart component of our application, we are going to inject here the store of application state. We are going to add the private keyword so that it's available here, and whenever the user is selected, we are going to call the store and we are going to simply dispatch a new action. So the action that we are going to dispatch, let's create it here in our actions file. This is simply going to be a class similar to these other two, so we are going to call it select user action. So like the other actions, this will simply have here a type. Let's define it here, the select user action. So this will simply be a string and we are going to use it here on the type of the select user action. Let's create a constructor which takes the following payload. The payload will be of type number. So this will contain the user ID of the new user. So how do we use this action? Let's simply dispatch it here in the user selection component. We are going to instantiate the select user action. With Alt Enter we have imported it, and now we are going to pass into the constructor the new user ID. Now let's take a look at what this action will do in the store. Is there anything that is done immediately when we receive the new user ID? Well, if we take a look here at the UI state of our application, one of the properties is the current user ID. So we are going to add a reducer function that is going to populate this variable. So let's go back here to our reducers, and in the UI state reducer we are going to add here a case clause for this new type of action, which is the select user action. Let's import it. Let's have a look at the import statement. So in this case branch of the switch we are going to handle this new type of action. So in that case we are going to create a new version of the state. So again we are going to clone it using object.assign, and we run into a situation here where we have here 2 times the same variable defined. So what we can do, for example, here is we can refactor the handling of this action into a function. So the function would be called handle select user action. But at this point, when we pass in action to this function that we just created, we can see here that we get an error concerning the property payload that is marked as mandatory and action expects it to be optional. So if we go here, we can mark this property here, for example, as optional, and this would fix the error. So now the error is that we are not returning anything from here. We can now create here a clone of the UI state, and let's start by returning it simply to fix the compilation error. So this is the new state. Actually, we can call it new UI state so that it's clear what type of state it is. Now the way that we populate the new UI state is we fill in the property user ID with the payload of the action. So now at this point in the program, we have the new user ID in the store. Actually, let's have a look. I think that before we had hard-coded it. Here it is. We had hard-coded it to 1. Let's put it to undefined so that the application initializes and no user is defined. So as we can see, the reducer action is very simple. We simply set the current state in the store, but we don't actually load the data for that user. We're going to do that with an effect. Let's see how we can do that in the next lesson.